Hello there, good afternoon to one and all. My name is Owsley Brown, and I am this year's honorary chairperson of the 19th Annual Festival of Faith. I want to welcome everybody both here and also online. Thank you all for joining. We are happy to say we are streaming live this entire festival, and of course we'll have all the programs on our YouTube channel after the fact as well. So please spread the word. And also please know we have many great programs still to come. As you probably saw on the way in, we've got lots of catalogs to give to you as presents from us to you, and feel free to share those with your friends, and lots of schedules also. To say, of course, that all of this is made possible by a huge amount of work that goes into putting on the festival, principally led by our festival staff, and our executive director, Dr. Kathleen Lyons, is here to my right, and she ably leads an incredible team here in Louisville, along with lots of volunteers. And so our great thanks to you and your team, Kathleen, but also to our financial supporters. Chief among them for many years now has been Brown-Forman Corporation. Also, we want to thank the Archdiocese of Louisville, a partner of ours from the beginning. Also, Hilliard Lyons, Hospice, Norton Healthcare, PNC Wealth Management, and Wyant, Tarrant, and Combs. I'm additionally pleased to announce that our best attempts are being made this year to be a zero waste event, and we are doing all that we can to see that less goes into the landfill. And we can tell you more about that in the lobby, but it's very much a part of our attitude and approach this year, and we're happy to tell you more about that if you are curious. We have a great program today, another great one tonight. Don't miss that one either. But to introduce today's program, I present to you Dr. Kathleen Lyons.
Thank you very much, Owsley. Before each of these programs, I've heard Owsley very graciously acknowledge the work of the staff. I think it's high time that we acknowledge the work of the chair of the 2014 festival. So let's have a nice round of applause for Owsley Brown. I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce you this afternoon to Sister Monica Weis, Professor of English at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. Dr. Weis holds the PhD degree from the University of Virginia. Among her impressive publications are two books on Thomas Merton, entitled Thomas Merton's Gethsemane, Landscapes of Paradise, and The Environmental Vision of Thomas Merton. Both of these books, I want you to know, were published at the University of Kentucky. Her credits also include serving as a Fulbright visiting professor at the University of Panoia in Veszprém, Hungary, in the fall of 2011. Dr. Weis will contribute to the day's general theme of restoring health and well-being in an address with the engaging title, Finding Oneself in the Cosmic Dance, Nature's Grace for Thomas Merton. Dr. Weis will deliver her address and will be followed by a panel moderated by Father Joe Mitchell, the founder of the Earth and Spirit Center, which has for its purpose to help to restore the sacred connection between earth and the spirit. He will be moderating a panel consisting of Sister Clair McGowan, who's the Director of New Pioneers for Sustainable Living, also by Mr. Tim Darst, the executive director for the past 7 years of the Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light, and Dr. Kyle Kramer, who comes to us from St. Meinrad, where he directs a graduate theology program, where he is also an organic farmer, and he brings with him in both capacities a knowledge of the great agricultural tradition initiated and sustained by the Benedictines. Our program this afternoon will begin, as do all of our programs, after we have observed 3 minutes of sacred silence. This will enable us to make the transition between what we have been doing and thinking about and what we will be doing and thinking about in the panel discussion in the program, about to begin. Please welcome with me Dr. Monica Weis.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm absolutely delighted to be asked to speak at this gathering devoted to sacred earth and sacred self. It's a theme that would be very dear to the heart of Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk from the nearby Abbey of Gethsemane, well known to many of you for his startling moment of spiritual insight at 4th and Walnut, now 4th and Muhammad Ali. At that corner, in March of 1958, during the busy lunchtime crisscrossing of men and women, Merton, aged 43, had a profound experience of waking from a dream of separateness, of discovering that he was related to every one of these people, and that there was a spark of divinity within each one, if only they could realize, as Merton wrote, that they are all walking around shining like the sun. If you were here for the opening call to worship on Tuesday evening, you heard our mayor, Greg Fisher, quote Thomas Merton and this episode. Other speakers also have referred to Thomas Merton, and I'm discovering that some of the themes and ideas presented by our speakers have great resonance with some of the things that Merton has said and written. So I know that you see Merton as something of a spiritual figure for you, and some of you probably even consider him the patron saint of Louisville. But I want to set this moment of 4th and Walnut, this moment of spiritual insight, into a larger context, one in which Thomas Merton was being schooled in the sacramentality of nature, one in which nature was slowly influencing his outlook, his prayer life, and his compassion for all creatures on the planet. Merton's short life of 53 years was, in a deep way, a sacred pilgrimage in which his experience in nature helped him discover the importance of being in a contemplative stance toward all life, what the English mystics and more recently the Jesuit Walter Burckhardt has called a long, loving look at the real. To be sure, Merton was no stranger to the beauty of nature. His parents, Owen Merton and Ruth Jenkins Merton, were both painters, and baby Tom's first word, as recorded by his mother in the baby book, was color, a word that Tom applied to the landscape, his father's pictures, and all the paraphernalia of painting. Some years later, as a teenager studying the classics and foreign languages at Oakham in Rutland, England, Merton loved to escape the noisy dormitory and squabbling adolescence to sit alone at the top of Brook Hill, a short walk from the school, and he especially loved the winter sunsets. He writes lyrically of that experience, and I quote, "The sky would get streaked with slate-colored clouds, and the west would fill with a soft, pale crimson haze, with the sun a diffuse red blur in the middle of it, hanging there for a long time while the valleys darkened and smoke spread flat over the frosty thatch of the villages, and the trees held their bare branches utterly still in the cold and silent air." We wish all teenagers could write like that. As a university student doing the grand tour of Europe, Merton was attracted first to the classical antiquity in Rome and then to the stunning Byzantine mosaics in churches such as St. Cosmas and Damian near the Forum and Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. Later, as a graduate student at Columbia University in New York City and a new convert to Roman Catholicism, Merton was attracted to the beauty of art and nature in William Blake's poetry. Still later, as a teacher at St. Bonaventure College, now university in western New York State, Merton loved to walk the snow-covered paths, reciting the hours from the breviary. In good weather, he loved to climb the grassy hill behind the academic buildings, now known as Merton's Heart, for solitude and meditation. And then a dramatic change. Having made a Holy Week retreat at the Abbey of Gethsemane outside Bardstown, Merton was smitten by the silence and solitude of the Kentucky hills. As he wrote in his best-selling autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, the rolling country and the pale ribbon of road stretching out as gray as lead in the light of the moon beckoned to him. Once inside the monastery, the beauty of the liturgy and the rigor of the lifestyle captivated his heart. He came to regard Gethsemane as the center of America, holding the country together. This is a great and splendid place. I tell you, I cannot breathe. One might think that Merton's entrance into a strict cloistered monastery would cut off his interaction with nature, and paradoxically, it was nature that called him into deeper levels of prayer. For example, 7 years after entering the monastery, on the vigil of the Feast of the Visitation, July 2nd, 1948, Merton stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the low, slanting rays of the sun as they picked out the foliage of the trees and highlighted a new wheat field against the dark curtain of woods on the knobs that were in shadow. I looked at all this in great tranquility, with my soul and spirit quiet. For me, landscape seems to be important for contemplation. Anyway, I have no scruples about loving it. No scruples about loving nature. This admission validates Merton's developing life of grace that was being nurtured by the multiple faces of God revealed uniquely in each creature. The morning light, the Kentucky knobs, the grassy hills, the flora and fauna of the monastery grounds. And it validates the decision of the abbot, Dom James Fox, a year later, to grant Merton permission to go beyond the confines of the enclosure, to pray in the monastery woods. As Jonathan Montaldo has noted in Volume 2 of Merton's journals, June 1949 marks an important turning point in Merton's vocation, when he breaks out beyond a past mental and physical confinement. I would add that judging from the increasing number of nature references in Merton's journal after this date, his spiritual awakening makes a quantum leap. This one small permission to pray outside the monastery cloister propels Merton into sharper levels of awareness that not only transform and deepen his spiritual life, but also summon him to greater silence and his final years of contemplative solitude in the hermitage. Indeed, writing about that first day wandering the hills and the fields beyond the cloister wall, Merton enthusiastically describes the power of the experience, and I want to quote him. First, I stopped under an oak tree on top of the hill behind Nally's and sat there looking out at the wide sweep of the valley and the miles of flat woods over toward the straight line of the horizon where Rowan's Knob is. As soon as I get away from people, the presence of God invades me. Invaded by God? Quite a startling verb choice, yet one that captures the intensity of Merton's spiritual experience and his willingness to risk transformation. Merton's abbot mentions this event in a letter to Claire Booth Luce that, quote, Merton came back just quivering with happiness and ecstatic joy, as if he had just taken a long plunge and swim in silence and solitude. A few years later, Merton writes in his journal, I belong to this parcel of land with rocky rills around it, with pine trees on it. These are the woods and fields that I have worked in and walked in, and which I have encountered the deepest mystery of my own life. And in a sense, I never chose this place for myself. It was chosen for me. One could say that Merton's longing for a place to call home, his longing for a deeper relationship with the divine, is being transformed into a sense of belonging. Wandering the fields and the knobs of the monastery helped Merton discover and experience the relationship between sacred earth, sacred self. Allow me to offer as testimony to my claim 2 rather ordinary yet startling examples recounted in his journal, New Year's Day 1950 and February 10th of the same year. So the first one, New Year's Day 1950. In the midst of a raw downpour, probably something like we had yesterday, Merton set off into the woods, eventually climbing one of the steepest knobs. Reaching the top, he comments, "I found there was something terrible about the landscape, but it was marvelous. The completely unfamiliar aspect of the forest beyond our rampart unnerved me. It was as though I were in another country." And an inner voice spoke to him, "Now you are indeed alone. Be prepared to fight the devil." Well, if you sense here a resonance with William Wordsworth and his quest for an experience of the sublime when crossing the Simplon Pass in the Alps, you're not mistaken. Merton is definitely on a quest. But just like the Hebrew prophet Elijah's experience, God does not always speak in the mighty wind and rain, but in the silence of the quiet breeze. And so too for Merton. Disappointed and believing that he had been on a fruitless quest, that he had not been privileged to engage in some existential battle with the forces of good and evil, Merton begins descending the hill. And like Wordsworth in the Alps, Merton experiences a shock of mild surprise. Here's what he writes. Halfway down, and in a place of comparative shelter, just before the pine trees begin, I found a bower God had prepared for me, like Jonas's ivy. It had been designed especially for this moment. There was a tree stump in an even place. It was dry, and a small cedar arched over it like a green tent, forming an alcove. There I sat in silence and loved the wind in the forest and listened for a good while to God. Wow, a bower designed for him by God. That's a medieval word usually associated with the marriage bed. What intimacy. What an experience of the sublime in nature. What a moment of spiritual awakening. Merton concludes this journal entry with these telling words. The peace of the woods steals over me when I am at prayer. Nature has provided not the backdrop, but the vehicle of contemplation for Merton. In such intense moments of communion, matter and spirit reveal to Merton their essential unity. Inner and outer landscapes merge. That's the first example. Here's the second one. 2 months later, Merton has another significant spiritual awakening. While praying one evening in the garden house attic that served as a quasi-hermitage for Merton in those early days, he became aware of the starlings singing and moving about on the ground, but he writes, "Like lightning it happened. From behind the house and from over my roof, a hawk came down like a bullet and shot straight into the middle of the starlings just as they were getting off the ground. They rose into the air, and there was a slight scuffle on the ground as the hawk got his talons into the one bird he had nailed. It was a terrible and yet beautiful thing, that lightning flight, straight as an arrow, that killed the slowest starling." Merton tries to resume his prayer, but the hawk, enjoying his dinner in the adjacent meadow, evokes in him a series of distractions, medieval falconry, Arabian princes, and the way that some people love war. But in the end, writes Merton, and this is what is important in this scene, I think that hawk is to be studied by saints and contemplatives because he knows his business. I wish I knew my business as well as he does. Wow, again. Here's a somewhat common event illustrating the food chain of our planet, yet Merton is discovering significant spiritual insight from it. Practice, practice, practice. That hawk had honed his hunting skills over weeks, months, years perhaps, and Merton's awe at the bird's focus is a poignant reminder to hone his own skills of solitude and contemplation. I think it's useful to listen to Merton's interpretive concluding paragraph to this event, in which he draws out this spiritual lesson. In it, he addresses the hawk as a fellow artist, reveling in his craft, and also alluding to Jared Manley Hopkins' poem, The Windover, about a raptor who, for Hopkins, symbolizes Christ. Listen to Merton. I wonder if my admiration for you, the hawk, gives me an affinity for you, artist. I wonder if there will ever be something connatural between us, between your flight and my heart, stirred in hiding to serve Christ, as you, soldier, serve your nature, and God's love 1,000 times more terrible. I'm going back to the attic and the shovels and the broken window and the trains in the valley and the prayer of Jesus. Practice, practice, practice. If you heard Gary Snyder last night say, when you meet someone on the path, they say, who is your teacher and what is your spiritual practice? Here we are. I think these two illustrations of Merton's spiritual awakening in nature are indicative of the power of nature to evoke prayer, as well as reinforce his commitment to the community recitation of the Psalms 7 times a day and the ongoing study of the fathers and doctors of the church and the medieval mystics. These two illustrations provide clues for understanding Merton's fascination with nature, namely his realization that the earth and self are related, and that both reveal what we might call a holy energy of the present moment. And this brings me more specifically to an event that is closely linked to the title of my talk, Finding Oneself in the Cosmic Dance. The scene is 10 years later, June 5th, 1960, Feast of Pentecost. Merton's desire for more silence and solitude has been satisfied. The abbot has granted Merton permission to pray in an abandoned tool shed he names St. Anne's. Merton has been ordained a priest for 11 years. Recent books such as Seeds of Contemplation, The Sign of Jonas, No Man is an Island, Selected Poems, and Thoughts in Solitude have been published, the latter drafted in summer afternoons within the confines of St. Anne's. Merton is currently proofreading the galleys for disputed questions, and plans are being made to build a simple structure on the clearing known as Mount Olivet, which before the year is out, will become the hermitage Merton is allowed to use daily, and then in August of 1965, permanently. But for now, Merton has often prayed alone in the novitiate or outside in the woods. His childhood talent for noticing everything is in full sway. And on this great feast of Pentecost, the birth of the Christian church, Merton not only delights in his solitude, but also recounts at length in his journal his exuberant and joyful experience of discovering the full meaning of lauds, the official morning prayer of the Christian church, during that pre-dawn hour, not in the chapel, but in the woods. Recited, as Merton says, against a background of waking birds and sunrise, he details the process of dawn, and I want to quote. At 2:30, no sounds except sometimes a bullfrog. Some mornings he says, Om. Some days he is silent. The sounds are not every day the same. The whippoorwill, who begins his mysterious whoop about 3 o'clock and is not always near. Sometimes, like today, he is very far away, in Linton's woods or beyond. Sometimes he is close on Mount Olivet. Yesterday there were 2, but both in the distance. Such keen observation Such a level of awareness developed from lifelong habits of noticing details of his surroundings. And Merton continues, and I'm quoting, "The first chirps of the waking birds, la pointe vierge, the virgin point of the dawn, a moment of awe and inexpressible innocence, when the Father in silence opens their eyes and they speak to him, wondering if it is time to be. And he tells them, yes. And then they one by one wake and begin to sing. First the catbirds and cardinals, and some others I do not recognize. Later, song sparrows, wrens, etc. Last of all, doves, crows." Notice the awe and innocence of this description. The birds ask if it is time to be. Not just, can I wake up and move around, but can I come into being? What clarity and what profundity. Merton has skillfully articulated the genesis of day, the sacred moment of creation that is repeated daily all over our planet, indeed at every moment, even now, as the Creator lovingly keeps all of us in being. Yes, Merton is a good writer. We might be tempted to dismiss this account as mere poetic whimsy or the rhapsodic gesture of a pen gone wild, but Merton is not finished. His next paragraph, which does not occur in the more detached version published later in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, identifies the intimacy of this spiritual awakening, the more intense dawn or dawning that's taking place in his inner landscape. Listen to his journal response to this awesome moment. "With my hair almost on end and the eyes of the soul wide open, I am present without knowing it at all in this unspeakable paradise, and I behold this secret, this wide open secret which is there for everyone, free, and no one pays any attention, not even monks, shut up under fluorescent lights and face to face with the big books and the black notes and with one another, perhaps no longer seeing or hearing anything in the course of festive lauds. With my hair almost on end?" Another wow. In 47 words, all but 3 of them with monosyllabic Anglo-Saxon roots, that's the English teacher speaking, Merton has captured the essence of spiritual enlightenment. He sketched for us the first glimpse of morning and allowed that physical light to pierce the darkness of his soul. The dawn, and every day for Merton, becomes a true experience of contemplation. The eternal, awesome break of morning echoes his equally awesome internal spiritual awakening. With his hair standing on end, Merton is fully alive, enjoying an unforgettable and deeply focused experience of contemplation, of the now. Seems to me that Merton captures the energy of this spiritual experience 2 years later in New Seeds of Contemplation when he defines contemplation. He says, "Contemplation is the response to a call from him who has no voice and who yet speaks in everything that is, and who, most of all, speaks in the depths of our own being. It is awakening, enlightenment, and the amazing intuitive grasp by which love gains certitude of God's creative and dynamic intervention in our daily life. Contemplation is life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive." We are privileged in Merton's journal to witness this awareness, this intense personal engagement with creation. Yet we must not overlook a tone of lament in his interpretive comment, which comes later. A lament that the monks in their chapel, looking at their big books of chant under fluorescent lighting, are missing the essence of the experience. Although this Genesis event is repeated daily and open to everyone, only those who have eyes to see and ears to hear can enter into the depths and the richness of this moment. For the time being, however, Merton is alone in this great communion and the invitation to trust in God's mercy, which Merton writes is what I have not done. And that word mercy is important. Merton's Dawn is a powerful spiritual lesson about the necessity of awareness, focus, and the value of practice, practice, practice that uncovers the greatest grace of all, God's mercy. Merton often returns to this theme of mercy. It appears at the end of the famous Fire Watch passage in The Sign of Jonas, July 4th, 1952, when in awe looking at the expanse of sky, he imaginatively hears the voice of God in paradise say, "What is vile has become precious. What is now precious was never vile. What was cruel has become merciful. What is now merciful was never cruel. I have always overshadowed Jonas with my mercy, mercy within mercy within mercy." A few years later, coming down to the monastery from the hermitage on a frosty winter morning under a multitude of stars, Merton, again in the awesome presence of nature, has that spiritual awakening to this gift of mercy. He writes, "I was suddenly hit, as it were, with the whole package of meaning of everything, that the immense mercy of God was upon me, that the Lord in infinite kindness had looked down on me and given me this vocation out of love, and that he had always intended this, and how foolish and trivial had been all my fears and twistings and desperation. Mercy, a wonderful spiritual awakening to an immense gift of God's compassion." But let me return for a second look at our dawn birds and their request to be. When Merton revises this passage for inclusion in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he places it centrally as the opening vignette in part 3 entitled "The Night Spirit and the Dawn Air." In this revised for publication version of Le Point Vierge, the intimacy of the moment, the stark honesty of Merton's hair standing on end is omitted. Because Merton is constructing, as he says in his preface, his personal vision of the world for the 1960s by fitting passages together in new and spontaneous ways. He has the reader in mind as the primary target of his remarks, not Merton's own intimate and spiritual reaction to the event. Consequently, in the reconstruction of that journal passage, more detail is given to the slow procession of dawn and the awakening of the birds, possibly so that the reader can transport him or herself into the scene. The bullfrog in the pond gets another sentence of description. The whippoorwill's call is now mysterious and uninterrupted. And similarly, Merton's original lament that others do not see the amazing event extends beyond the monks, blinded by their fluorescent lights and large choir books, to indict all of us. We, now, the readers of Conjectures, are his audience, the ones missing the awesome and central, yet delicate and merciful action of God. We are the blind, and Merton chides us, quote, "Lights on, clocks ticking, thermostats working, stoves cooking, electric shavers filling radios with static. Here is an unspeakable secret. Paradise is all around us, and we do not understand. It is wide open. Wisdom, cries the dawn deacon, but we do not attend." Not the monks, but we now stand exposed, duly chastised. One consistent phrase, however, that appears in both the journal version and the published Conjectures is worth mining for its original significance and Merton's intent in retaining it, mainly le point vierge. This French phrase can be traced ultimately to the Sufi mystics by way of Merton's correspondence with Louis Massignon, yet it cannot be satisfactorily translated. English speakers usually take it to mean the virgin point, the cusp, or the break of dawn, that awesome moment of transition between light and dark, night and day. But I like to describe it as the moment of poise when just about anything is possible. In the world of Shakespeare, for example, Midsummer Night's Eve is such a virgin point. It's a moment of poise when fairy magic can alter the usual and expected rhythm of the world. If we move to the area of athletics, Le Point Vierge, for the competitive platform diver, is the moment of poise when balanced on her toes and envisioning the triple somersault with a half twist about to be performed, the diver, and indeed the whole crowd, holds its breath for what will transpire. For the basketball star standing at the free throw line, it's that timeless pause just before his fingers release the ball. When Merton uses the phrase Le Point Vierge, he's investing the phrase not only with the meaning of virgin point, but also with what scripture scholars would refer to as added levels of meaning, what we might call surplus meaning. Certainly in the dawn passage in this journal and its revision and conjectures, Merton is intending to lyrically pinpoint the mystery of transformation, the magic of each day's creation. To have birds daily asking the Father permission to be, and to have them waking up one by one, paints a stunning picture of creation and recreation. Le Point Vierge, the pregnant moment of poise and God's generative mercy that enfolds us. But Merton intends more resonance, more layers of meaning to this phrase than mere lyricism, surplus meaning that becomes clearer in conjectures and in the miniature vignette of his days in the Hermitage, written that same year and entitled Day of a Stranger. Let me see if I can explain this clearly. In Conjectures, a mere 25 pages after the dramatic opening scene of the bird's awakening, Merton inserts the account of his spiritual awakening at 4th and Walnut. This published version has the added imagery, not found in the journal version, of the people all walking around shining like the sun. As he expands this journal account of his epiphanic moment to reflect further on its spiritual meaning and discovery of his unity with each of them, Merton returns to that phrase, Le Point Vierge, pertaining now to the spark of divinity within each of us, that is God. Le Point Vierge is still the virgin point, the moment of poise, but it takes on surplus meaning. Here's Merton's description. Again, that expression, Le Point Vierge, I cannot translate it, comes in here. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness and of absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It is, so to speak, His name written in us as our poverty, as our indigence, as our dependence, as our sonship. It is like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody. And if we could see it, we would see these billion points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I have no program for this seeing. It is only given. But the gate of heaven is everywhere. For sure, another lyrical passage. But now the beauty and sharp imagery of La Pointe Vierge, the Virgin Point, is not just out there in nature. It is within each human being. Yes, it's the moment of creation, that daily creation of the world and the second-by-second recreation of our being, but it's also the living presence of God within us. La Pointe Vierge is both an event and an indwelling. It's both a point in time and an experience of being. Another wow. La Pointe Vierge for the birds is their innocent awakening in response to the Father's ongoing love. La Pointe Vierge is also the sustaining spark of divinity within that allows us to recognize our unity with each other and with God's self. If we saw ourselves as we really are, shining like the sun, we would rejoice in that absolute poverty within, because there, in that inner point of nothingness, we discover God. We discover our true self in God. Merton, the bystander, sees the beauty, innocence, and free gift of dawn expressed intimately in the birds asking the Father if it is time to be. Then they awaken one by one. Merton, the guilty bystander, as he calls himself, committed to solitude and contemplation, experiences a related awakening, namely that our inner absolute poverty is to be recognized, celebrated, and cherished, because this is where we truly exist in God. This inner nothingness, untouched by sin and by illusion, is, because of God's mercy, the hidden ground of love. This inner nothingness, this point of Vierge, is our paradise, and its gate is everywhere, if only we are aware. How does Merton do it? How does Merton grasp such weighty theological insights and offer them to us in simple yet challenging pictures? Surely he can do it because he is a writer. Surely he can do it because he works at responding to grace by means of silence, solitude, and contemplation. But just as surely, nature plays a part in the revelation of divine secrets. In the silence of the dawn, watching for the first sign of light, Merton sees not only the genesis of the day, but also his own inner genesis that is always innocent and pure. When the birds say yes to the Father, they wake up. When Merton acknowledges the pure glory of God within, he says yes to a fuller and deeper level of prayer and spiritual consciousness. Awakening to the presence of God within is responding to the generative power of the Creator to be in a new way. Remember Merton's startling journal description of that experience. With my hair almost on end and the eyes of the soul wide open, I am present without knowing it at all in this unspeakable paradise. Merton picks up this same theme of spiritual awakening and the gift of mercy in his 1965 description of his life in the Hermitage, published as Day of a Stranger, and note again the word stranger. Merton lives in the woods, he says, of necessity in a kind of ecological balance. Each day is immersed in nature, increased awareness of mercy, and attention to the call to be. Daily, he writes, I am out of bed at 2:15 in the morning when the night is darkest and most silent. I find myself in the primordial lostness of night, solitude, forest, peace. A mind awake in the dark, looking for a light, not totally reconciled to being out of bed. A light appears, and in the light, an icon. There is now in the large darkness a small room of radiance with psalms in it. The psalms grow up silently by themselves, without effort, like plants in this light which is favorable to them. The plants hold themselves up on stems which have a single consistency, that of mercy, or rather, great mercy. Magna misericordia. In the formlessness of night and silence, a word then pronounces itself, mercy. The birds begin to wake. It will soon be dawn. What to make of yet another exuberant description of the breaking dawn, Le Pointe Vierge? First, I think we must acknowledge Merton's love of an immersion in nature. And then, in light of his use of the term twice in Conjectures, and his obvious reference to it in Day of a Stranger, we must recognize and acknowledge the power of nature to inform his spiritual life. Merton's journals and published writing confirm that nature is a primary vehicle for experiencing the inner secrets of the divine, for experiencing them deeply, profoundly, and with lasting impact. Dawn, Le Pointe Vierge, and its accompanying gift of mercy signal not just another Genesis moment at 24-hour intervals, but the continuous revelation of the divine in the unfolding of the universe. Merton's love of color, landscape, creatures, stars, dawn, nourish his contemplation of this unfolding and his growing compassion for all creation. Indeed, as Merton's awareness of external landscape intensifies, his awareness and exploration of his internal landscape also intensifies. And in that inner landscape, there is room for compassion, room to embrace issues of social justice, nonviolence, dialogue between East and West, Buddhism and Islam, and the health of the planet. Finding God in creatures was not, as Merton first believed, merely a stepping stone to God, but rather a bursting forth of ongoing encounter with the divine. Once he discovered how landscape is important for contemplation, and once he was permitted to wander in the woods, lakes, and knobs beyond the confines of the enclosure, Merton's capacity for contemplation and compassion expanded. As he declared in an August 12, 1965 journal entry, our very creation itself is a beginning of revelation. Making us in his image, God reveals himself to us. We are already his words to ourselves. Merton could not be more clear. Our creation is itself a vocation to union with God, and that union includes harmony with all of God's creatures. Sometimes we mistakenly think of important God moments occurring only at Christmas or Easter or Pentecost, and that Advent and Lent are meant to sharpen our focus for these great liturgical celebrations. But we need to be aware, and Merton's life offers witness to this lesson, that God's action is not restricted to holidays, holy days, and kairos events of momentous import. The magnificence of sunrise, with its dailiness, its inevitability, its cyclic rhythm, is also stunning and can evoke spiritual awakening. The birds never tire of coming to be. They wake up and become birds. Not a miracle of transforming themselves into another species or a mutation into some master flock, just ordinary birds waking to an ordinary day. Merton knew in the depths of his whole being how God's presence is known in both the peak moments and the natural rhythms of the day, ordinary time, daily moments like sunrise, silent rain, the hint of spring in the greening woods. It's ordinary moments like these when we too, if we are keenly aware, if we are open to the possibilities that reveal God, God reveals God's self. But lest you think that Merton's spirituality is merely a personal and individual one, I want to share with you a little-known action of Merton that supports his growing awareness of the importance of compassion in action for ecological justice. And this connects with something we heard this morning. In April 1965, Merton was asked by a British activist to write a statement for a manifesto against factory farming, an issue about which Merton confessed he was somewhat ignorant, yet a practice he deemed an example of, quote, very significant and rather disquieting picture of modern man, unquote. 2 years prior to this request, Merton had written to Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, that her expose of our widespread use of DDT was, quote, more timely than even you or I realize, and that Carson was, quote, contributing a most valuable and essential piece of evidence for the diagnosis of the ills of our civilization. And that letter is reprinted in your catalog booklet, so I invite you to read it sometime. So it's not unrealistic to believe that Merton would be sympathetic to those against artificial factory farming because, as Merton wrote for the manifesto, quote, factory farming exerts a violent and unnatural force upon the living organisms of animals and birds in order to increase production and profits, unquote. Merton was willing to have his name added to the list of protesters, and he writes further, since it, factory farming, involves callous and cruel exploitation of life with implicit contempt for nature and for life, I must join the protest which is being uttered against it. However, this is only one aspect of a more general phenomenon, the increasingly destructive and irrational behavior of technological waste and finally to production for destruction. Its orientation to global war is the culminating absurdity of its inner logic or lack of logic. The mistreatment of animals in intensive husbandry is the part of this larger picture of insensitivity to genuine values and indeed to humanity and to life itself, a picture which more and more comes to display the ugly lineaments of what can only be called by its right name, barbarism. Oh, it's pretty tough. But Merton had a few other opportunities to speak his mind on eco-issues. In the last year of his life, Merton read and reviewed Roderick Nash's book, Wilderness and the American Mind, which offered a summary of our attitudes toward nature from the Puritans' belief that wilderness was evil, to the transcendentalist view of nature as spiritual symbol, to Theodore Roosevelt's efforts for conservation, to Aldo Leopold's development of a land ethic, which has become the basis of our current conservation law. Merton's review of this book, first published in the Catholic Worker and the Center magazine of summer in 1968, highlights Leopold's definition of an ecological conscience, which is this: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Merton adds his own spin to this principle, namely that an ecological conscience is essentially a peacemaking conscience. In other words, he acknowledges our week's theme. Both earth and self are sacred. Both earth and self cry out for harmony. Both earth and self demand response, healthy nurturing, and preservation for future generations. In the final paragraphs of the essay, Merton poses a piercing question to each of us. Can Aldo Leopold's ecological conscience become effective in America today? In 1968, Merton would not have recognized the language that we are familiar with in ecological circles, things like precautionary principles, or true cost accounting, or local economy, or sustainability, or externalities. His particular gift was to live on the margins so that he could see better and more deeply. He lived both inside his monastic community and apart in the hermitage. He was committed to silence and solitude, yet he demonstrated compassion for the world through his writing. He was a bystander by choice and a participant in the dialogue of the 60s on war, racism, and technology. He was a monk of the Western tradition, yet studied Eastern thought, especially Zen. He was practical, clearing brush and pruning trees in the woods, yet sitting quietly in the woods for prayer. He was trained in Lectio Divina, yet able to read the scripture of nature. Merton was a monk whose love for outer landscape merged with the inner landscape of his heart and enabled him to challenge us to new levels of contemplation and compassion. Merton was a monk who could write in thoughts in solitude, "Everything I touch is turned into prayer. Where the sky is my prayer, the birds are my prayer, the wind in the trees is my prayer, for God is all and all." Merton was a monk whose counsel we need to heed, especially because he understands how God delights in creation. And so I want to let Merton have the last word today and quote from the end passage in New Seeds of Contemplation, where he offers us an invitation. And it is this: "The Lord plays and diverts himself in the garden of his creation. And if we could let go of our own obsession with what we think is the meaning of it all, we might be able to hear his call and follow him in his mysterious cosmic dance. We do not have to go very far to catch echoes of that game and of that dancing. When we are alone on a starlit night, when by chance we see the migrating birds in autumn descending on a grove of junipers to rest and eat, when we see children in a moment when they are really children, when we know love in our own hearts, or when, like the Japanese poet Basho, we hear an old frog land in a quiet pond with a solitary splash. At such times, the awakening, the turning inside out of all values, the newness, the emptiness, and the purity of vision provide a glimpse of the cosmic dance. We are invited to forget ourselves on purpose, cast our awful solemnity to the winds, and join in the general dance." Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Weis, for a stirring and a beautiful talk. Our panel will begin now, and I invite our moderator, Father Joe Mitchell, to come to the stage, along with the panelists, Sister Clair McGowan, Mr. Tim Darst, and Dr. Kyle Kramer.
Monica, thank you. You invited us into the cosmic dance. So before we dance, why don't we stand? Take a moment. Let's take a moment. We're going to have a conversation now, and there's some people invited up here to the stage to help initiate the conversation. But to do that, why don't you just turn to somebody near you, and we'll just spend about a minute standing, but also a minute just to share what struck you of what you heard. In other words, of all that you heard Monica bring forth about Merton, what struck you about it? Just take a minute to talk to somebody about that. It doesn't matter to me. Welcome. Welcome. So. Monica, I'm going to, you know Thomas Berry, don't you?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you, so I'm going to begin by asking you a question about Thomas Berry and the...
It was great. I laughed. I cried. It was better than Cats.
About Thomas Berry's calling the earth sacred itself.
Sacred, okay.
You know, I'm going to just mention...
Differentiation, interiority, and communion.
Right,
I'm
yeah.
ready to go.
Well, but just what Merton would say about that, of the earth itself being sacred, not just a sacrament, but a sacredness about it. So I'm going to just start off with that kind of question.
You're going to get us started, right, Joe?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to ask a question first.
Feel really stretched.
Oh, dear. Are you going to go talk to...
Could have been serious.
And there was
Oh,
a
good,
seed from my lunch that was
hope it
coming
goes well.
out of the
No, I'm just talking softly. Okay, could we come back together then? We'll have a chance to sit down. So, Monica, I want to thank you again, I think on behalf of all of us, for it takes somebody from New York to help us know more about our local saint,
Your local saint.
Thomas Merton. So I wanted to, there's so many things I wanted to reflect on about what you said, but let me start off with something that you began with and talked about. You talked about the sacramentality, in Merton's strong sense of sacramentality, in the that the earth was able to radiate God and manifest God. So at the end, you were talking about how we don't experience God necessarily, or we think we experience God in like holy days, like Christmas and holy times or churches and so forth. Well, there was I remember many years ago when I was in theology reading a survey done by Andrew Greeley, the famous sociologist.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a survey that he did asking people the question, where do you experience God? And he said, we theologians, or we people in church, tend to think that people would say they experience God at our religious services. Or certainly they must experience God when I'm giving a homily. Or certainly they must experience God when they're praying in church. But he said, no, by far, most people said they experience God in the natural world. That it's in the natural, it's in the beauty of a sunset, or you mentioned the silent rain or the greening of spring and so forth, and those seem to be the moments that wake up people. Then why did Merton say, I have no scruples in loving this? What's the deal with, it seems like for him to put it that way, I have no scruples, means he feels like he shouldn't find God there. He should find God in the monastery, but instead he says, he wrestles. So is it what?
Okay, that's the young Merton, who has been in the monastery only 7 years at that point, when he says, I have no scruples about loving it. But remember, all of us are products of this Western Cartesian split between matter and spirit, and we think that matter is bad and spirit is good, and we've inherited that. It's part of the Western philosophy. Merton had that too, and he had to get over it. So I think when I latch onto that quotation, when he says, I have no scruples about loving it, it's the beginning of a conversion, of a transformation. So that's in the 1947 era, 1948. So then it's later when he says things like, I belong to this parcel of land and it was given to me. So each of us is on a journey. If we think of the whole world, or think of the new cosmology that someone like Thomas Berry has written about so poignantly, about the earth, the whole planet is sacred, that it is God-filled, and with the new cosmology that all of us are in evolution, and it is the unfolding of God's love, and we are part of that, 15 billion year story that is unfolding. That language was foreign to Merton, but that concept was coming through because of his prayer. That sort of answer,
Yeah.
your sense? It's
Well,
the young Merton, and then
So Merton had to go through a conversion.
lots of conversions, lots of.
So what would he say to us today about many people who feel like they don't find God in the natural world? In other words, many people feel like the natural world is simply a profane place, and yet the church is a sacred place. And even though our sensitivities or experiences tell us that we experience God in our everyday world, there's still like this mental block that we all have. So does Merton ever write about in any way to help us break through that those scruples we might have.
Had he lived beyond age 53, I think he would have. But I think his that question at the end of the last public document we have from him called The Wild Places, is the name of that essay, when he says, can Aldo Leopold's ecological conscience be effective in America? I think there he's asking us, can we begin to see that there isn't a division between inner and outer, between matter and spirit, that all of this is an expression, an overflowing of God's diversity. Each of us is a face of God. Each creature is another face of God. And that's one of the things that the people that are so concerned about biodiversity and the extinction of species, that's another face of God that's lost. Something to think about.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, we want to add some more voices to the conversation as well, and I think Claire, Sister Clair McGowan, you've been reflecting on this for a while.
I've been reflecting on this for a while, as all of us here have. And I find it interesting that my thoughts are kind of shaped by 3 monks, all of whom are named Thomas. So it's my brother Dominican, Thomas Aquinas, who taught that, and this was in the 13th century, he taught that the natural world is the primary book of Revelation, and that, in a way, scriptures are secondary. So the first way we know God, Thomas Aquinas said, is in our experience of the beauty and wonder of the natural world. And then, as you've elucidated so beautifully, Monica, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, discovering the depths of God in the forests and the knobs, the sunrises, and the birdsong around his own Abbey of Gethsemane. And then, of course, many of us having been influenced by the third great monk, Joe's brother, Thomas Berry, in more recent time. And his writings have exponentially expanded our understanding of the foundations and the relationships that constitute that natural world. So all 3 of these Thomases, mystics and scholars at different moments in history, have sought truth and made such huge differences to humanity. In my own role as a sustainability educator and advocate, I would say first about myself that I'm a seeker of truth. Being a Dominican, we would assume that. But the truth that I eagerly seek is truth that can make a practical difference in how the world unfolds. And I suspect that many of us in this room seek that particular dimension of truth. So as we look at the questions today, mine are very practical ones about what does contemplation mean now? If it's true that the natural world is our first teacher of God's ways and God's wonders, then it's pretty clear that a lot of things have gone badly awry. One dilemma is that in this postmodern and urban and digitalized world, many people rarely contact the natural world at all. A second dilemma is that the notions of God that have been passed down to us over the centuries do not fit with our present understanding of the evolutionary process. And the third, of course, is the growing awareness that this magnificent natural world created over billions of years is now deteriorating rapidly at our own hands. So if Walter Burkhardt is right that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real, my question is, can looking long and lovingly at God revealed in the beauty and wonder of nature be sufficient for contemplatives in 2014? As the child asked the Velveteen Rabbit in that wonderful book of the 60s, what is real? Lately, the real has been hitting us over the head with stunning clarity. There's been many mentions over these days of the festival of the IPCC's 7-year report saying that the impacts of climate change are occurring throughout the world at unprecedented rates and faster than they ever anticipated. Then 2 weeks ago, we got the National Climate Assessment confirming that climate change is already affecting every region of the United States, and the impacts of it will worsen if we do not begin now to reduce seriously our fossil fuel consumption. Then last week, the World Health Organization reported deteriorating air quality in many of the world's cities, killing 7 million people a year. And 2 days ago came reports that the Antarctic ice sheet has begun an irreversible melting process. That is a lot of real to take in 1 month's time. So the information is clear that if we stay on the current path, there is little hope for health and well-being in the days ahead. But what will steer us off the current path and onto a new and healthy one? Would we dare to say that contemplation is the key to the human transformation so urgently needed right now? I tend to believe so, but I believe that at this time in the evolutionary process, we must conceive of contemplation more deeply and more broadly. My experience in working with faith communities around how do we as people of faith create a sustainable future, I often give a list of things that we can do to take home, and the first one is to pray. But I'm very quick to clarify to people, I do not mean to ask God to fix these problems for us. I mean to ask God to help us to see how we can find the wisdom and the courage, each of us, to do our unique part in transforming the world. Pretty different understandings of prayer. In working on the Bluegrass Pipeline, we've discovered many people know very little about state government, about the basics of local government. In working with the energy vision that the communities of Catholic sisters here in the Kentucky Holy Land have been promoting, we find that many Americans have very little understanding of greenhouse gases or fracking or the impacts of the Keystone Pipeline or of the positive potential of renewable energy. So what I'm getting at is if we're going to meet the enormous challenges before us, I think the religious traditions must stretch our understandings of contemplation. I think a long, loving look at the real today means that we need to learn how to discover God in the beauty and in the destruction of the natural world. So to look long and lovingly at the real means looking at and learning to understand the patterns, the policies, and the economic forces that are destroying the natural world. So I think contemplation today needs to include study, the disciplined work of learning what is going on with our energy systems, with our food systems. I think contemplation today must also include community, the web of loving and sturdy relationships that overcome isolation and create the possibility of making an impact on the larger world. And finally, I think that contemplation must include action, loving action for positive change. Perhaps a simple story best illustrates my message. The other day, as I was coming home from work, getting out of my car, my young 9- and 7-year-old neighbors came running toward me. "We saw a bird hatch. We saw it hatch. Do you want to come see it?" I shouted. These little girls had been contemplating the bird nest for weeks, their own long and loving look at the real. And they had been rewarded with a revelation that few adults have actually ever seen, the great mystery of new life emerging from a small blue robin's egg. Of course, I said yes, and we hurried over to the tree. And while we were going, they instructed me very confidently, "Now be very careful. Don't touch anything, or the mother might not come back. And we have to watch out for the possum." Seems that as these children engaged in contemplation, they were at the same time studying, learning the patterns of the birds and of their predators. In their contemplative process, they had formed community by enlisting their big brothers not to harm, but to help protect the baby birds. And they had created a plan of action to keep the possum away, yes, but also to invite others like me to come and contemplate with them. Now, what was it Jesus said about suffer the little children?
Very good. Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Sure, yeah. Well thought out and with passion. With passion. Well, I want to maybe get you and Monica talking for a moment about something you said that struck me, if that's fair enough to frame a question or discussion for a moment. You said that a long, loving look at the real can be a look at a lot of destruction. So it's not just finding God in the beauty of the natural world, but God in the destruction of the natural world. And that reminded me of something that Thomas Berry said that was puzzling to me for a long time. He said, "What a privilege it is to live at a time when we can witness the withering of the earth in its Cenozoic expression." And he said, what a privilege it is to live at a time when we can witness the withering of the earth in its Cenozoic expression, meaning to witness the earth being destroyed as we know it now. So that seemed to resonate. That resonated with me when you said that. So does Merton ever speak about he took so many pictures of the natural world and spoke about the beauty of the natural world. Did he ever address that issue of the destruction? He was in touch with Rachel Carson.
Well, he was in touch with Rachel Carson, but I'm thinking what's coming to my mind is a letter from Czesław Miłosz, who criticized Merton for not taking any attention to the destruction and the terribleness of nature, the red tooth and claw approach of nature. And he said, you never talk about this stuff. Merton's response to him was, no, it's all part of the whole picture. I don't need to focus on that. It's part of, and so I think he would see it as a kind of wholeness or a rhythm of coming and going. But not exactly to skirt your question, but to go back to what you were asking Claire and talking about it, I'm thinking about the session we're going to have tonight on these photographs that are stunningly beautiful on ecological crisis moments, that here they come. And so it's not one or the other, but maybe it's another opportunity to take a long look at the real and say, oh, that picture, that photograph is stunningly beautiful. Now, what does that mean for me? How do I respond to it? There was another thought that was coming to me as you were talking about the importance for action. As part of Merton's spiritual evolution, first is the silence. Then there is the call to solitude. And then there is the developing of compassion and the turning toward the world. So compassion or prayer can never just be for oneself and one's happy feeling. It always has to move into how do we include all into it. And that requires some action. So as soon as you move from silence to solitude to compassion, that's when Merton had his turning toward the world movement and started writing about the dangers of technology and the important rights of indigenous people and the problems of war. When we became very vocal about those things. And then toward the end of his life, we get a little sense of that he sees justice is also eco-justice, justice for the planet. And I'm always saying that had he lived longer, we would have gotten a seminal essay out of him. But I think there are enough little senses there. So he would agree with you that this has got to evolve into action. And that it calls us together for community, too, that we don't do it alone.
And that as religious leaders, we need to figure out how to pick up on that. You know, it may well be there in Merton, but how do we as a faith community help our people, help our communities, help ourselves to discover that unless we're willing to learn, to study, to understand what's going on, we can't really have a real relationship with God. I think that message is not being preached as effectively as it needs to be.
Right. Well, how does that tie in with the sacramental theology? I mean, you're a Catholic nun, Catholic sister, so sacramental theology is a big part of your life. How does it, because they often, I mean, you hear theologians talk about if the waters are polluted, then how can we have baptism in polluted water? Mm-hmm. But do you think we can have baptism in polluted water?
Well, we do.
Yeah, we do, sure. But you know the point, in other words.
We obviously do.
Yeah.
I think in the Catholic tradition, we've narrowed the focus so much on 7 sacraments that in some ways it's been a disservice because we sometimes fail to recognize the sacramentality of everything.
We used to call them sacramentals.
Yes,
Yeah, mini sacramentals. Yeah.
Right. So, I think there's a foundation there that we could build in from the Catholic tradition that would be a gift to the world, but we've got a lot of work to do to make that gift
sure, but
as
there's a foundation and heritage there, but that could be brought forth in a new expression in this case. Yeah, it'd be fascinating to look at how we can take polluted water and make it a sacrament. It's an interesting piece. Mm-hmm. Let me ask Kyle, so you come at this as a organic farmer, as somebody, you said in the Benedictine tradition, who's rooted to the land, and then also as a director of a lay formation program. So you've been thinking about this as well.
I have. And, Merton's journey at Gethsemane was in many ways, I think, a healing journey. You see how he evolves there. And I've had my own healing journey. And so I wanted to share just sort of a very practical kind of narrative of what happens essentially when you read way too many Wendell Berry books. And,
is that possible?
You can't quite get to the end of 50, but I want to start this story with a confession. I probably should in a room like this. I was not always sort of an earnest tree-hugging environmentalist. I actually grew up in southern Indiana with a jacked-up four-wheel drive pickup truck and a dirt bike tearing through the stripper pits. So I've had my own sort of conversion, and I've seen both sides of this. I was also a pyromaniac Boy Scout, and those were my chief connections with the natural world, is tearing it up. But then I went to college at IU, and I encountered Scott Russell Sanders. If you haven't read any of his stuff, I'd highly recommend it. And he became a mentor to me through his writing and personally, and he introduced me to Wendell Berry, his works and Wendell personally. And frankly, they ruined me. They ruined that life I'd had. They woke me up to the need of a healthier relationship between us and the rest of creation. And I wasn't exactly sure what to do with that epiphany, besides, of course, selling my truck and my dirt bike. And so it took the rest of college and several years of graduate theology study. And what I finally realized was what was most important to me was actually a kind of lifestyle, more so than a particular job or career. I wanted a way of life that looked like putting roots down in a particular place, living simply, doing healing work on a small piece of land, very much like Merton was called to this stability of life at Gethsemane. I, of course, wanted to do Daniel Boone and go off grid and grow everything myself and maybe end up as a full-time organic farmer. That would be living the dream. And it was a totally romantic dream, of course, but sometimes that's what it takes to get you to take a leap of faith. And I searched and searched for a patch of land in Indiana, and I finally found one, and the only reason I could afford it was because it was utterly ruined. It had been cropped to death, the timber had been cut out of it, it was eroded, it was overgrown. So we're talking about witnessing the destruction of nature. I saw it on this piece of ground, and yet, as I stood on that piece of ground, amidst its ruin, it spoke to me, and it said home. And it said, Kyle, I know you have all these world-changing big dreams, but if all you ever do is invest yourself here in this place and work for its healing, that's enough, and everything else is gravy. So hearing that voice, I took the leap of faith, and I sold off stuff, I bought the land, and I came back to try and make a go of farming. And I really did it the hard way. I camped on this land for about a year with no heat, no electricity, no running water, no toilet, a 5-gallon bucket for a toilet. And as I built a bachelor cabin and a farm and tried to make something of this ruined land. And I remember oftentimes sitting there as mice are scurrying around me, and I'm swatting mosquitoes thinking, okay, so this is what all these years of graduate school have done for me. Thank you a lot, Wendell Berry. But as they say in Monty Python, it got better. I think what made it so hard was not just the rough circumstances, but feeling like and Wendell actually uses this language, and it haunted me for a long time, feeling like I needed to be worthy of the place. Like I couldn't admit that I didn't actually know what I was doing, and that I wasn't exactly sure how to heal this place. I had the principles, and I didn't have the practice. And I remember I was trying to clear one of these overgrown fields with this junky old tractor that I'd bought and tried to keep running, and of course it dies on me. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I literally threw a temper tantrum in the middle of the field. I started throwing my wrenches into the woods and screaming at this machine that wouldn't run. And I turn, and about 20 yards from me is this guy walking across the field, who turns out to be a new neighbor of mine, who stopped by to see who had bought the old Brinkman place. And so, of course, he's seen this whole tirade. And I kid you not, he comes in, he fixes this tractor with a piece of baling wire. He gets it running. And I was kind of stunned at the whole situation. And I try and thank him. He says, no problem. Welcome to the neighborhood. And I realized then that I didn't have to know it all. What I had to do was be willing to admit my ignorance and to depend on others, to be welcomed into that community. And it wasn't just being welcomed into the neighborhood per se, it was being welcomed, I think, into the largest neighborhood. There was another time, a few weeks after having met John, I was doing chainsaw work all day, clearing trees and things like this. And it was, if you've ever worked with chainsaw, you know it's dirty, it's noisy, it's destructive work in a lot of ways. And so I felt a great deal of ambiguity about that. And I ended the day, and I sat in the back of my truck as the sun went down. It was November, it was cold, I was shivering, but I waited until the sun went all the way down, and the sky became black, and the stars came out, and where I live, you can see that stripe of the Milky Way kind of stretch across the sky. And I think that was my Fourth and Walnut moment. That was the time when I heard that the ground rules of the universe are mercy and forgiveness, and that even my kind of stumbling, ambiguous efforts were enough. I felt, sitting in the back of my truck, looking up at those stars, that I was part of something larger, something much more wonderful, the cosmic dance, I think, to use this language. I felt like I belonged, not by my own willpower and skill and cleverness, but by gift and by grace. And I eventually also felt welcomed in marriage and family life. The person who cut my hair said, the way you're living, Kyle, you are doomed, either to bachelorhood or to a mail-order bride catalog or something like that. But I was fortunate enough that a Louisville priest friend of mine introduced me to a wonderful woman who was not afraid to live an hour from the nearest Starbucks. And but she did want a flush toilet, so we
You compromised.
So yes, marriage and family life have certainly led to compromise on the land. But what that's ended up showing me is that it is not just about me living out these kind of narcissistic environmental ideals, so that I could have a clean conscience and I could have bragging rights about how green I was. It wasn't about me at all, is what I came to learn. It was about my kids and your kids and everybody's kids and the poor and future generations. It was part of that broader community. So very quickly, what have we done in 15 years on the same patch of ground? With the help of friends and family, we eventually built a real house, not the kind of excuse for a bachelor pad that I had first constructed, and it is it's very green. It's passive solar. It's got wood heat. We capture all our rainwater. We have all our hot water is solar heated, and we now have solar panels, so many such that we sell power back every month. So I guess we're net positive. And the farm didn't turn out like I thought. I didn't end up being a full-time organic farmer, but I've moved from, in the beginning years, larger scale market farming, and now toward, if you're familiar with this term, permaculture, or smaller scale, sustainable, mostly subsistence farming, although we still do some market sales as well. And we have learned a lot. I'm going to cut out a little bit for the sake of time, but I would say we've learned three things in terms of a healing journey, which I think relates to what we've been talking about with Merton and others. And first of all is that although it's undeniable how destructive we can be as human beings and as a race, our deepest human nature is to be healers. I really think that the truest form of earth care is not simply fighting destruction, although of course we have to do that, or trying to be sustainable, although of course we have to do that. The point, I think, is that at our core, we are not a cancer. We are not a planetary plague. Our deepest vocation is to be healers. It's in our nature to help the earth flourish and thrive more than it could without us. And so we're called to leave these places better and more beautiful than we found them. And we can do that if we listen to our inner nature. But this doesn't happen through raw moral willpower and workaholism. I have tried those things for years and they don't work. I've tried to be blameless. I've tried to fix everything. And I have gotten myself stuck in deep depression and the paralysis of perfectionism. And what our farm has taught me, very practically, very hands-on, is that the world is fragile and damaged, but it's also tremendously forgiving and resilient. It wants to heal. I think that's my second point about the healing journey. The earth wants to heal. And if we simply start listening to the rest of nature and working with her rather than against her, if we just make the smallest efforts along with the big efforts, the world and actually the whole universe will rush in to help us. That right there is the core of my hope for the future. And finally, kind of point number 3 about the healing journey is that and this I think ties in the sense of spirituality we've had in our journey on the farm, is what healing work requires of us ultimately is listening. A great deal of patience and humility. And obviously, these are spiritual practices. And if we cultivate them, I think we'll find that we're not simply helping to heal our land and our air and our waters, but we are being healed along the way, each one of us and all of us as a community. And we're being healed by a mystery that's far greater and more wonderful than we can name.
Very good. Thank you. You reminded me, as you spoke about your own struggle with wanting to be able to do it perfectly and be able to get it all right. I know many people hesitate to get involved in this whole enterprise of engaging the earth because they feel so like not even a novice. We've lost the ability to have a rapport with the natural world. It's like, where do we begin? It just seems overwhelming because it's like asking somebody to do ballroom dancing and you can't even walk. And thus so many people fumble. So what would you say to somebody like that? I mean, I know you struggle with your own, you said perfection, but you were way down the road. So how do you address that today? You're a teacher and you work with people who are beginning to engage these issues. So how do you encourage them, those that have no sense of connection?
This is going to sound unorthodox, but I would say stop reading gardening books. Stop reading books about the environment. I'm kind of saying this tongue-in-cheek, but my experience is people who are passionate enough to take the time to write a book are often quintessentially good at what they write about, and they give you the impression that you have to be too. And so the minute I was willing to set aside some of the rule books and jump into making my own mistakes and step back from the ego investment that I had in getting it right, and realizing it was okay to do it halfway at first, and then to learn from that. Yeah. So I would encourage people simply to jump in and make those mistakes.
So don't read.
There's a footnote there, right? But yes.
I got it. I know when I was first got involved in this, and I would begin to pick practices, things I wanted to do. And so it became rather clear to me that being a vegetarian was one of those things. But I still am invited to speak different places. So like yesterday, I just flew back from giving a workshop about a 3-hour plane ride. And so when I began to become a vegetarian, people said, but look at how much you travel. And so you can't do it all at once.
Right.
And so I realized you can't expect to be consistent when you get involved in this. You can't expect consistency in myself or in other people.
Embrace your inner hypocrite.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you think Merton did he have anything to say about Kyle framed it as a healing journey, about the healing capacity of the earth, or the capacity of the earth to heal us, not just to be a sacramental presence, but also to be a healing presence?
Not in those words, although several times he would say something like, this is the most important moment of my life, or this is the most important experience that I've had. And I remember Bill Shannon saying to me one time, he says that 8 or 9 times in his journals, just don't pay attention to it. It was his kind of catchword for this is an experience of wholeness for me. One of the things, people have asked me what I'm going to do now that I am 3 days retired from Nazareth College, what I'm going to do next, and I want to explore Merton's interest in Celtic spirituality, which is a way of looking at streams of wholeness. In the last 4 years of his life, Merton kept reading a lot of books about Celtic spirituality and has more than 175 pages of handwritten, hard to read, notes from books that he's taken. And I think it was this notion of wholeness, not so much healing, but wholeness, and a sense of affirmation for him of what the early Celtic monks were doing and committed to, that he's beginning to see comes full circle in his life, and that the ancients are doing things that he has discovered. And also some of his roots are Welsh, so he's interested in that from a genealogical perspective. But I think that's where the healing notion comes in.
With the wholeness,
sense of wholeness,
the idea of
yeah.
wholeness. Yeah. I just had to give a talk to on an interfaith symposium on the Christian perspective of the ultimate goal. And they asked me to give a talk on the concept of salvation. So I was doing some research on the etymology of the word salvation, which of course is
wholeness.
It's the primary way Christians speak about the ultimate goal. Yeah, and it comes from actually a Sanskrit word that means all, the totality. So it came from that. But we also have the word salve, which means an ointment to bring about healing, or salubrious, which means well-being and health. And so the actual word salvation doesn't mean a destination out there. It's not salvation is some other place beyond the world, but rather it's a wholeness or completeness that we can experience in this lifetime.
Yeah.
So.
Tim's been silent for too long.
That's exactly what I wanted
to say.
I was exactly going to get a segue into Tim, because Tim is the executive director of KIPL, Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light, which is a national organization. The Interfaith Power and Light organization is, but Tim is our Kentucky executive director, and also a great advocate for living locally. And so how do you, well, let me ask what you've thought about this, so maybe you can bring forth what you've been thinking about, and then I have a question.
Well, throughout this I've been thinking, what can we take away from this? What message can we learn from Merton as we're facing the greatest environmental crisis, as Sister Clair was talking about, this climate change that's overwhelming, depressing at times. It's so big, as you mentioned. It's so hard to even think, how could we react to this? But I think there are two things that we can take away from Merton that he has to offer. One is contemplation, and the second is living simply. Contemplation, of course, is the very beginning and helps us to take a step back, to get out of this society, this consumptive society that is moving so quickly and is such a strong force that it seems like we don't have a lot of choices in our lives. A lot of the choices are made for us. It's moving us in a direction. And if we can stop and take a step back and find those times where we can live more contemplatively and be mindful of our actions and the way that we're living our lives, this interconnectedness with other people, with God, with all of nature is very important. This interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, because we cannot stop ourselves from interbeing. We are connected to all things, through the air, through the water, through the soil, and our decisions will have an effect on the rest of the world, whether we want to or not, and they will either have a positive effect or a negative effect. And so on a daily basis, there are decisions that we can make. And if we don't take a step back and be mindful of that, then those decisions, we will just get into the habits that we have. We will listen to Madison Avenue and who tells us that we need to keep buying and consuming and help the economy. So being more mindful of what we're doing and looking at these little steps that we can take, because the little steps do add up to big steps and make a big difference. We probably all have a small list of things that we should be doing, things maybe we've heard about here at the festival, things we've heard from Wendell Berry or Kyle or Sister Claire, of things that we can be doing in our lives, and maybe take some time each day to contemplate that and start living more simply. It was probably easy for Merton to go to Gethsemane and live in a community like that where it's very simple. It'll be more difficult for us living in the world to be able to do this. It's very countercultural. But there are many simple things that we can do. I talked about reducing consumption. So reduce, reuse, recycle, but that very first one is the most important. Pre-cycling, they call it. Think before you buy things. Instead of immediately going and getting something, give yourself some time to think about it. Is this something I really need? Is this something that's life-giving? And if not, maybe I don't need to buy it at all. And if you are going to buy something that's reusable. There's so many times we buy things that we use for just a minute or less and throw it away and it goes into a landfill forever. And so thinking about those little steps. My wife and I did this with our electricity use. We became aware of things like mountaintop removal coal mining and how it's destroyed over 500 mountains in Appalachia, filled in over 1,000 streams. That's a million acres in Appalachia gone forever. And we wanted to make a difference. So we looked at our electricity use and we started cutting back. We got compact fluorescent light bulbs and we started turning off the television instead of just having it on all day. And we went to ceiling fans instead of air conditioning and Energy Star appliances. And these things don't sound like they're that big. But over a 5-year period, we were able to reduce our electricity use by 70%. And so these little things really do add up. We're some of the biggest wasters of electricity here in Kentucky because we have some of the cheapest electricity. And then looking at our transportation, riding the bus whenever you can, walking, biking, or simply not going to a place. I found myself going to a doctor all the way across town or a movie theater across town when there's one close by, or simply going out and spending time with the neighbors. Spending time outside, starting your own garden. We have a pretty good sized garden in our backyard, and spending our time doing that rather than driving somewhere or something that consumes electricity, connecting more with friends and family and being grateful for all that we have in creation. And that living simply has been very meaningful for us. It's something Merton got a lot out of, and it goes hand in hand with contemplation. So that's the two things I feel I got out of Merton's writings and listening today.
Yeah, very good.
That's good.
Very good. And I think I know I work with Tim, so I think you bring simplicity in your own life. You bring simplicity to great complexity. No,
Well, my wife often said there's nothing simple about living simply.
exactly. Yeah.
It's simpler to eat at McDonald's.
Exactly. Yeah. Simpler to eat at McDonald's. Right. Exactly. In many ways. But well, what was we talked a bit about, Kyle talked about one of his moments, and Sister Claire talked about her 3 Thomases, and we talked about Merton's. What was your epiphany moment?
You know, I never had that big conversion like Paul did on the road to Damascus or anything like that, but it seems like there's small things, little things. Just, going fishing with my grandfather when I was 10 years old, and he was a hunter and a fisherman, and he also lived through the Depression, and so he understands not wasting and, just an appreciation for nature and the importance of leaving a place in a better condition than when you got there. People that I've met through the years and gleaned a little bit about them through the years. I was taught by Ursuline sisters at St. Francis of Assisi School, and so an appreciation for St. Francis of Assisi and the importance of that, being in Boy Scouts and a lot of the important lessons I learned there.
He must have been in a different troop.
Yeah, we were in a different troop, yeah. And, yeah, growing up in the 70s, and there was just a lot of understanding of the connection to nature that I'm very grateful to have had that experience.
Mm-hmm. So it just came about, but people in your life that helped wake you up to it.
That's right.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you. Thank you. Monica, do you
I
have
have the
anything?
last word on this, or something
Well, I'm going to let
that's-
Merton have the last word,
Okay,
but you have the second to
Merton had
last word.
I'm thinking of Sister Elaine Prevelet, who's a sister of Loretto who lives south of here. And she talks about pockets of hope. I think that Merton is a pocket of hope as we look at his spirituality. I think this festival is a pocket of hope in all of the people that have spoken. And I'm thinking of all the people that are out there still. Each of you is a pocket of hope for whatever you can do in your little small sphere of circle. If we're all a web and connected, it makes a difference. It's it. So just saying pockets of hope.
Pockets of
Take
hope,
that phrase
yeah.
with you.
And La Pente Vierge, you know,
La Pente
the
Vierge.
glory of God within us. And I think if we could, the more we can see the glory of God, Merton said, if we could only recognize that glory of God at all times within us,
Yeah.
meaning our sacred self, but also if we can only recognize that glory of God in the sacred earth. I think it's a huge step to say that the earth itself is sacred, not just that it manifests the sacred. It's a big difference between saying the earth manifests or is a sacrament of the sacred, but to say the earth itself
It
is
is.
sacred
It is.
means that it also, like ourself, is filled with soul. And it too is radiating the glory of God.
Our buttons. You are sacred. I am sacred. And you are also to the earth. We say that.
Very good. So with that, let's take 1 minute and we'll sound the gong and take 1 minute to just hold in our hearts that glory of God within us and let that La Pente Vierge come forth for a moment. So I'll ring the gong and then a minute we'll have for silence as we've been doing. That's been our tradition here to begin and end the sessions with a moment of silence. So if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. There's going to be an opportunity for the conversation to continue because as we leave, we all pass through the lobby and there's refreshments there. So please feel free to linger if you can. There's refreshments with wine and cheese, among other things, so we can have a chance to continue the conversation. I'll do book signing. Oh, that's right. And Monica will be there to do book signing as well. And Kyle. Kyle too, also, yeah. And then don't forget that tonight there's another session from 7 to 9, and it's going to be a multimedia presentation it's on reflections through art. So as Monica mentioned, from Henry Fair's photographs, we'll be looking at the images of the earth in crisis. and that'll be through those photographs. But also there will be excerpts from a film on Wendell Berry and the agrarian life, and the filmmaker, Laura Dunn, will be here, called 40 Pains. So it'll be a multimedia presentation here from 7 to 9, and I think tickets are still available for that. And then also there's one more added workshop tomorrow. We have the regular scheduled program, and it's in your booklets or in the schedule. But tomorrow afternoon at 12:45, there's going to be a workshop. It'll be a 90-minute workshop on sacred living within the home. So maybe it's following up on what Tim asked with being contemplative, but also looking at ways we can live more simply in the home through intention, prayer, and ritual, and to bring spiritual presence into our ordinary, everyday family dynamics. So it's going to be a 90-minute workshop on sacred living within the home tomorrow at 12:45. So thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, for coming. Kyle, Claire, thank you for your comments and reflections. And of course, Monica, thank you so much for coming to be with us during this festival and helping us to recognize the sun shining within our earth,
Yes.
within ourself, and within the sacred soil. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming as well. Thank you.